In this video, we're going to be looking at applications, and I do want to have a quick little disclaimer. The problems that I'm going to solve can be solved without an equation, but we are going to get into problems that are too difficult to solve without setting up an equation, so that's why we're going to practice on these simpler ones. Okay, so first we have to identify and define the variable. So this is really important. This just means what is the thing that I don't know that I'm trying to figure out? Because if we don't know where we're heading, then we're not going to get there. That's a life thing too. All right, so A, we're going to work through these steps as we're solving this. It says 331 students went on a field trip. 6 buses were filled and 7 students traveled in cars. How many students were in each bus? So our variable here, what we're trying to figure out is how many students in each bus. And so you could use whatever variable you want. I'm going to use B, and I'm going to define B as the students in each bus. Okay, there are a few different ways to set up this problem. I like to do it as what is the total? So in this case, we have a total of 331 students, right? Now we know that there were 6 buses were filled. So there's 6 buses, but we don't know how many students were on each bus. If we did, what we would do is take that 6 and multiply it by how many students were on each bus. So say there were 2 students on each bus, which would make no sense. But we had 6 buses, 2 students on each bus. That means there would be 12 students on the buses. Well, we also had 7 students who traveled in cars. So now I've set up the equation, and B represents the students in each bus. So now all I have to do is isolate the variable and solve. So I'm going to subtract. The reason I'm subtracting is because that's adding. Don't forget that you're doing what you do to one side, you do to the other side of the equation. So on this side, we have 324. And then to get that B by itself, I need to divide both sides by 6. And I get B is equal to, that's 54. Which is a reasonable answer, right? 54 students on each bus makes sense. If we had gotten an answer like -3, we would probably have to reevaluate our equation because that doesn't make sense for there to be negative students at all. All right, let's look at B. So Aaliyah had $24 to spend on 7 pencils. After buying them, she had $10. We want to determine how much should each pencil cost. So I'm going to use P. It doesn't matter what letter you use for your variable. I like to do something that makes sense, but just be careful when you do that. Like using S's sometimes look like 5s. Using L's sometimes look like 1s. Anyway, so this is the cost of each pencil. Okay, so we can set this up a couple of different ways. Aaliyah had $24, so she started off with $24. And she spent money on 7 pencils. So we're going to subtract, because when you spend money, you lose it. It's going away. 7 pencils, well, we know there's 7 of them, but we don't know how much each of them cost, so that's when we use our variable, P. And we end up with $10. All right, so I'm going to use some inverse operations here to get P by itself. The first thing I'm going to do is subtract 24 on both sides. So -7P equals, this is -14. To get P by itself, I need to divide. The reason I'm dividing is because, remember, this is multiplication. So I'm dividing both sides by -7. And so I get an answer of P equals 2, which means that each pencil costs $2. Which is a little expensive for a pencil. Maybe they're a nice mechanical one or something. But it's still like a reasonable answer. Let's look at C. You bought a magazine for $5 and 4 erasers. You spent a total of $25. How much should each eraser cost? So we have our question. We have to define our variable. What do we want to know? We want to know how much should each eraser cost. So I'm going to use E. And this is the cost of an eraser. All right. So let's go back and read the problem and see if we can set up an equation. We had a magazine for $5, but we just bought one, so it's just a magazine for $5 and 4 erasers. So it's going to be 4 times E. I'm adding because we want to figure out the total amount. Well, we know the total amount is 25. The reason I'm adding is because we bought both of those. The other thing to note is that I multiplied 4 times E because E represents the cost of an eraser, and I had 4 of them. So to figure out the total cost of that, I just do 4 times E. So now I can solve by getting E by itself. I'm going to subtract 5 because this is a positive 5, and I have to do inverse operations. So then I have 4E equals 20. Remember, 4E just means 4 times E. So to undo multiplication, I have to divide on both sides. So E is equal to 5. So each eraser must cost $5. Again, pretty expensive for an eraser. But at least in this context, like, that makes sense. It's not a negative number. It's not like more money than what we spent total of. So it's a reasonable answer. In this problem, it says Maria bought 7 boxes. A week later, half of all of her boxes were destroyed in a fire. There are now only 22 boxes. With how many did she start? So what we don't know is how many boxes she started with. So I'm going to use B for boxes initially that she started with. So first, that's what we can start with. She had B, boxes, and then she bought 7. So she bought 7. We're going to add 7 to that. But then, a week later, half of all her boxes were destroyed. So what I need to do is half of this. There's 2 different ways to do half. I could do it like this. Half. That's also the same as saying B plus 7 over 2. So both of these are saying half of B plus 7. So multiplying by half is same as dividing by 2. So I'm going to use this one in the equation, but they mean the same thing. So B plus 7 divided by 2. And she ended up with 22 boxes at the end. So now I'm going to use my inverse operations to solve. Because this is dividing the whole thing by 2, I want to get rid of that fraction by doing the inverse of dividing by 2. The inverse of dividing by 2 is multiplying by 2. So we have B plus 7 equals 22 times 2 is 44. Now to get B by itself, I'm going to use my inverse operations and subtract 7 on both sides. And I'll end up with a final answer of B equals 37. So she must have started with 37 boxes. Moving on to E. So we have Sanaya, who won 40 super bouncy balls playing horseshoes at her school's game night. Fun. Later, she gave 2 to each of her friends. That is so kind. Now she's only got 8. So how many friends does she have? Okay. So I'm going to use F for the number of friends. That's not the hashtag of friends. All right, so she won 40, so we started with 40, right? But she ended up giving 2 to each of her friends. So if she's giving them away, that means I must subtract 2 for each friend. So if she had 1 friend, it would just be 2. If she had 2 friends, it would be 4. 3 friends, 6. So what we're doing there is multiplying 2 times the number of friends that she has. At the end of all this, she only had 8 bouncy balls remaining. So let's solve this equation. Remember, we're trying to get the variable f by itself, so we're looking for inverse operations. Now, the first thing I want to move is this 40 out here, so I'm going to subtract 40 on both sides. That leaves me with negative 2f equals negative 32. Now to get f by itself, we're going to divide both sides by negative 2. Because this is multiplication, we got to undo it with division. So F is equal to 16. So she had 16 friends. Okay, so Imani spent half of her weekly allowance playing mini golf. To earn more money, her parents let her wash the car. What is her weekly allowance if she ended up with $12? All right, so our goal is to determine what is her weekly allowance. So I'm going to define that variable A as her weekly allowance. You could use W. It doesn't matter what variable you use. Some students always like to use X, so there's no problem with that. That's great. All right, so if A is our weekly allowance, let's go back through and create an equation. So she spent half of her weekly allowance playing mini golf. So she had A, her weekly allowance, but she spent half of it. So now she's only got half of it. So I'm going to divide it by 2. You could also do 1/2 times A. Remember, those are the same thing. But to earn more money, her parents let her wash the car for $4. So she had half of her allowance, but then she got $4 more, right? If she ended up with $12, how much was her weekly allowance? So let's solve this. I want you to note here that we're not going to multiply by 2 first because the +4 is not in the fraction, right? So I can actually get rid of the +4 first, and I'm going to do that by subtracting 4 on both sides. So then we have A divided by 2 equals 8. Now to get A by itself, what I need to do is multiply both sides by 2. So A is equal to 16. So how much was her weekly allowance? It was $16.